My friends, as we begin our work together this evening, let us come gently into the recognition that the great struggle of humanity has never been with God, but with its own concept of God. For centuries, men and women have knelt in sincerity, in devotion, in longing, and yet have cried out in frustration, "Why are my prayers unanswered?" And the answer is as simple as it is profound. We have prayed to a God who is not there, not because God is absent, but because the God we have addressed is a God of our own imagining, external, distant, withholding, reluctant, everything the divine presence is not. The central mistake of human prayer is the belief that God must be informed of our need, persuaded into action, or moved by our pleading. But I say to you, the moment you ask God for something, you have already stepped out of spiritual reality. You have declared, without knowing it, that you and God are separate. You have assumed that God possesses what you lack, and in that one assumption, you have created the very barrier that makes your prayer fruitless. You see, prayer is not the means by which we draw God's blessings down to earth. Prayer is not a transaction between the needy and the divine. Prayer is not a request. True prayer, spiritual prayer, is the opening of consciousness to the presence that has never withheld anything, the presence that is the life and substance of your own being. I would like you to understand this with great clarity. When you ask God for anything, you are praying as a beggar. When you recognize God as the infinite activity of your own consciousness, you pray as the Son of God. And only the prayer of the Son can be answered, for it is not a prayer to get, but a prayer to behold. It is the prayer that acknowledges, the Father and I are one. All that the Father hath is already mine. We are not here tonight to learn how to make God work for us. We are here to learn how to rest in the awareness that God is already working, already fulfilling, already expressing. The infinite way is not a method of manipulating the divine, but of becoming still enough to witness the divine unfoldment taking place through us. And so, let this be our foundation as we go forward. True prayer does not move God. True prayer moves us into alignment with a presence that has never moved. Let us move a little deeper now, and let us do it gently, because what I am about to say will seem, at first, to contradict everything religion has taught you. But when you feel it inwardly, when you sense the truth of it, you will discover that it is the most natural understanding in the world. When you ask God for anything, you are not drawing God closer. You are pushing God away. You are placing the divine presence at a distance from yourself, and you are proclaiming that you, in this moment, stand outside of the fullness of God. It is almost as if you were saying, God has something that I do not have. God is somewhere that I am not. God knows something that I must try to obtain. And in that very attitude, you have stepped out of the reality of oneness and into the illusion of separation. Now, you may not do it consciously. You may pray with sincerity, with devotion, even with faith. But sincerity does not erase the fundamental error in the approach. Asking implies lack. Asking implies distance. Asking implies that God has not yet acted and must be persuaded to act. This is why so many prayers remain unanswered, not because God withholds, but because we pray from a consciousness that does not yet recognize God as the very life of our being. You see, whenever you pray for a condition to be changed, your health, your finances, your relationships, you are giving reality, substance, and power to the appearance. You are saying, this condition has power. This condition stands between me and God. God must intervene to correct it. But my friends, If you only knew the truth that lies behind the appearance, you would understand why asking does not work. You would see that there is no power in the problem, no intelligence in it, no law sustaining it. The only power it has is the power you unknowingly bestow upon it by treating it as something that God must come and fix. That is why Joel Goldsmith teaches again and again, the moment you fear a condition, the moment you resist it, the moment you pray to be rid of it, you have given it a second power, a power apart from God. And wherever you have two powers, you cannot experience the harmony of one. If God is truly infinite, omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, then where is this other power that you fear? Where is this condition that must be changed? Where is this lack that must be supplied? Where is this sickness that must be healed? Only in the human belief that sees God as separate, as distant, as needing to be called upon. And so prayer that asks blocks, prayer that pleads delays, prayer that tries to force something from God blinds you to what is already present. We do not ask God to heal. We recognize the presence that is health. We do not ask God to provide. We acknowledge the infinite source that is supply. We do not ask God to fix a relationship. We behold the spiritual identity that already is whole. Nothing is added. Nothing is removed. The prayer is not a request, it is a recognition. And when you recognize, something remarkable happens. You stop approaching God as a needy creature and begin resting as the instrument through which God expresses. That shift, subtle, inward, wordless, is the doorway to all spiritual demonstration. Now let us come to one of the most misunderstood statements ever uttered in Scripture, though it stands openly before every seeker who has ever reached for God. Your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask. My friends, consider what that means. If the Father already knows before you ask, what purpose is there in asking? If the divine presence is already aware of every need, physical or emotional, mental or spiritual, then the moment you kneel in petition, you are acting as though divine intelligence requires your instruction. And so, let us pause. Let us breathe that truth gently into our awareness. There is a presence within you that knows your need before you speak it, before you formulate it, even before you become aware of it. When you pray from the standpoint of lack, you contradict this truth. When you attempt to outline to God the nature of your need, when you say, Father, I need health, or I need supply, or I need peace, you are assuming that the infinite presence has overlooked something in its own creation and must be reminded by you. Yet the entire message of the infinite way is that God has already established within your consciousness every form of good you will ever require. It is there spiritually, invisibly, intact, awaiting recognition. Not awaiting request, awaiting recognition. Let me illustrate this gently. When you wake in the morning, you do not ask the sun to rise. The rising of the sun is already established. You simply open your eyes to behold it. In the same manner, supply is already present. Harmony is already present. Guidance is already present. Healing is already present. And your prayer is not an attempt to create these things, but to open the inner eye that sees them. You cannot bring God into your experience by pleading, because God is already the very life that animates your being. You cannot persuade God to give, because God is never withheld. You cannot awaken divine love, because divine love is the substance of your existence. All that you seek is already present in the depths of your consciousness, and the only veil that hides it from you is the habit of turning outward to a God conceived as separate. Joel Goldsmith said it plainly. The moment you seek God outside yourself, you lose the God who is within, not because God departs, but because your gaze has turned away from the secret place where God reveals God's self. To pray rightly, then, is not to inform God of your need, but to acknowledge that the Father within is already fulfilling every need, not as human conditions, not as improved circumstances, but as the activity of a presence that knows no absence, no lack, no limitation. And so, when we come to prayer, it becomes a quiet resting. Father, I do not need to tell you my need. You know it, and you are fulfilling it now, not because I ask, but because it is your nature to express your infinite completeness through me. In this recognition, prayer ceases to be a request and becomes a beholding. It becomes the sacred moment in which we see that everything needed for this day, every answer, every provision, every harmony is already established within the very consciousness we call I. Let us look now with a clear and gentle eye at the real reason supplication, begging, pleading, imploring fails to bring spiritual answers. It is not because God refuses to respond, nor because divine love withholds any good. It is because the very attitude of supplication arises from a consciousness that has accepted separation, and separation is the only illusion that can block the flow of grace. When you kneel before God in fear and say, Father, give me health, you have already accepted the premise that sickness stands apart from God and must be overcome by divine action. But in that single belief, you have unknowingly created two powers, a power in God and a power in the condition. The moment you grant reality to the condition, the moment you feel that it is something God must conquer, you have stepped outside the one power that alone governs all spiritual demonstration. You may not mean to do this. Your prayer may be filled with sincerity, devotion, even desperation, but the spiritual law is impersonal. Whether you recognize the truth or not, whatever you fear, you empower. Whatever you resist, you strengthen. Whatever you pray to change, you declare to be real. Now consider supply. When you pray for money, when you plead for employment, when you say, God, send me what I lack, you are affirming without ever intending to that lack is real and present. You are giving substance to the appearance. You are clothing the illusion with your belief, and you are approaching God with the hidden assumption that divine love has somehow neglected its own creation. And in that inner posture, the sense of lack is not dissolved, it is multiplied. This is why you must understand, supplication is not a spiritual act. It is a human response based on fear, and fear is the one veil that blinds you to the presence that has never left you. You see, every plea to God carries a subtle confession. I do not yet believe that the Father within is enough. I do not yet trust the completeness of the infinite presence. I still see myself as a separate creature, struggling my way toward God. And the moment you see yourself as separate, the moment you imagine God as distant, your prayer becomes an echo in the empty chambers of the human mind rather than an opening into spiritual realization. Let me say this plainly. You cannot pray from fear and expect the fruit of peace. You cannot pray from lack and expect the awareness of abundance. You cannot pray as a beggar and awaken as a son. The nature of God does not change because you pray. It is your consciousness that must change. It is your understanding of God that must ripen. It is the inner recognition of the one power, one presence, and one life that dissolves fear, lack, and delay. When you pray to fix a problem, you are praying from the problem. When you pray to remove fear, you are praying from fear. When you pray to bring good into your life, You are praying from the belief that good is absent. But when you rest, when you release, when you abandon the entire posture of asking, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop energizing the appearance. You stop strengthening the illusion. You stop giving power where no power exists. And in that quiet moment, the spiritual truth reveals itself. The very thing you were praying to receive has been present all along, unseen, only because your prayer was rooted in fear rather than recognition. In the silence that follows the end of supplication, grace performs its perfect work. Now, my friends, since we have seen that asking God for things creates separation, let us turn to the real essence of prayer, what Joel Goldsmith called the highest form of worship. And let me say at the outset that this is not prayer as the world understands it. It is not the moving of lips, the repeating of holy words, nor the recitation of favored passages. It is not a reaching outward, and it is not a calling upward. True prayer is the most intimate act of awareness, the silent opening of consciousness to the presence that is already here. In Scripture, we find the words, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." This is not poetry. This is not metaphor. This is the entire principle of spiritual prayer. We do not speak to God. We listen for God. And listening is not an activity of the ears. It is the quieting of the mind, the relaxing of thought, the resting of personal will, until something deeper, higher, truer begins to stir within. You see, the human mind thinks prayer is speaking, but the spiritual consciousness knows prayer is receiving. You do not come to prayer with petitions. You come empty. You come without an agenda. You come without demands. You come without fear. You come without the belief that something must be changed. And in that emptiness, in that stillness, the divine activity reveals itself. In the infinite way, we say prayer is not a request, but a receptivity. It is the clearing away of mental noise so the Christ can announce itself. When you are truly praying, there is no sense of trying. There is no strain, no pressure, no desire for results. The human mind, with all its arguments and anxieties, grows quiet. You are not seeking an answer. You are seeking an awareness. And the moment you enter that inner quiet, you feel a presence, subtle, gentle, entirely real, begin to move silently within you. This is the secret. Prayer is not your words reaching God. Prayer is God reaching you. In that inner contact, something happens that words cannot describe. It is as if a soft light begins to shine in the depths of your being. Nothing has changed outwardly, yet everything is different inwardly. Fear melts, tension dissolves, the sense of personal responsibility lifts. You feel enfolded in a peace that does not depend on conditions, and in that atmosphere of peace, divine wisdom begins its silent work. You do not guide it, you do not shape it, you do not tell it what to do. The still small voice reveals itself in its own way, in its own timing, for its own purpose. And often you find that what you thought was your need was never your real need at all. The presence knew your need before you formed it, and it meets that need in ways you could never have outlined or imagined. True prayer is the moment when the personal sense of I steps aside, and the divine I, the Christ, takes its rightful place. You do not gain anything through this prayer. Rather, you awaken to what was always present but hidden beneath the noise of human thought. This is why Joel Goldsmith often said, "Be still and listen." Not listen for words, not listen for messages, but listen for that inward shift that slight quickening, that deep assurance that the Father within is doing the work. When the mind becomes silent, the heart becomes a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, prayer becomes not a practice, but a state of being, a communion without words, a union without effort, a recognition without thought. This is true prayer. Listening, receiving, beholding. And in that listening, all good flows naturally, for the presence that governs your life is revealed as the only reality there is. As we go forward, let us enter one of the most tender and liberating principles of spiritual living, that the power behind prayer is not effort, not thought, not will, not belief. It is grace. And grace is not something you earn or achieve. Grace is the spontaneous activity of the divine within your own being. It is God revealing God, life revealing itself, truth expressing itself, without human help, human direction, or human interference. Now, we must be very clear. Grace does not act because of your prayer. Grace does not act because of your faith. Grace does not act because of your goodness. Grace acts because it is the nature of God to express its infinite fullness continuously. The only role prayer plays is to make us still enough, receptive enough, empty enough for grace to be felt, recognized, allowed. You see, the human mind imagines that prayer is some sort of mechanism by which divine law is set in motion, as though God waits for our words, or responds to our petitions, or is moved by our sincerity. But the infinite way reveals something entirely different. God is eternally active. God is eternally giving. God is eternally being God. The only thing that changes is our awareness of that eternal activity. When you enter the silence not to get, not to persuade, not to outline, but simply to rest, the personal sense of I becomes quiet. And in that quietness, an entirely different I begins to move. The I that is the very presence of God expressing through you as you. Grace functions the moment the personal self is absent. Look closely at your own experience. Every attempt to force a spiritual demonstration through mental work ends in strain. You may try to affirm truths, visualize outcomes, or direct spiritual energies. But all such efforts belong to the realm of the mind, and the mind, by its very nature, cannot touch the infinite. It cannot invoke spiritual power. It cannot reach God or move God. The mind can only create tension. Grace alone creates harmony. The question, then, is not, how do I make God act? The question is, how do I become still enough to witness God acting? And the answer has always been the same. You release effort. You release fear. You release the personal sense of responsibility to fix your life. You release the belief that things must change outwardly before peace can arise inwardly. Because, my friends, grace does not begin its work when conditions improve. Grace is the invisible law that causes conditions to improve. The activity of grace is not visible to the human eye. It works in the quiet recesses of consciousness. It works beneath thought. It works behind the scenes. It works without noise, without drama, without evidence, until, at the appointed moment, the outward picture gently shifts, revealing what has been taking place within all along. That is why healing often appears sudden. That is why supply often comes unexpectedly. That is why relationships harmonize in ways no human reasoning could have predicted. It is not that God suddenly intervened. It is that you became quiet enough to let grace fulfill what grace had been fulfilling all along. In true prayer, we do not direct spiritual law. We yield to it. We do not compel God. We let the presence be itself. We do not strive for results. We rest in the awareness that omnipresent love is eternally accomplishing its own perfect expression. This is the mystical mechanism of prayer. Effort belongs to the human mind. Fulfillment belongs to grace. And grace is already at work the moment you stop trying to make it work. Now, as we come further into this work, let us look gently at the practical side of spiritual living. Because the moment you stop asking God for things, something very real begins to happen in the outer picture of your life. Not because God has suddenly responded to you, but because you have become receptive to what God has been expressing from the beginning. Let us consider healing. When you pray for God to remove a condition, you are acknowledging the condition as real and powerful. You are placing it on a pedestal, granting it substance, and attempting to use God as a remedy. But when you cease praying for healing and instead rest in the recognition of one power, when you behold God as the only life, the only presence, the only law governing your being, the fear that sustained the condition dissolves. And the moment fear dissolves, harmony appears. The healing is not the result of asking. The healing is the result of recognizing that nothing needed to be healed. Let us turn to supply. When you stop approaching God as a banker, a provider, a source of material demonstration, when you let go of the anxious desire to secure tomorrow, you discover a remarkable truth. Your supply does not come from the world at all. Supply is the activity of God's presence expressing as ideas, opportunities, inspiration, harmony, and right unfoldment. And the more you rest in that recognition, the more the outer picture rearranges itself around your inner assurance. The demonstration is not the result of pleading. It is the fruit of knowing that your good is already established within. And now, let us gently look at relationships. When you pray for God to change someone, to soften their heart, to correct their behavior, you are giving reality to the belief that there is a separate person with a separate will that must be adjusted. But when you stop asking for harmony and instead behold the Christ in every person who stands before you, the miracle of relationship begins to unfold. You are no longer trying to fix a person. You are witnessing their spiritual identity. And as you witness it, they begin to respond from that identity, not because you asked, because you recognized. Consider also your daily decisions, your work, your purpose. The moment you stop asking God for guidance, because asking implies God is withholding guidance, you begin to feel a quiet inner movement, an intuition, a gentle nudge, a sense of rightness that does not come from reasoning. This is not something you have sought. It is something that has always been present, but could not be heard over the noise of asking. When you stop seeking answers, answers appear. When you stop fearing outcomes, outcomes take their rightful shape. When you stop striving to achieve, the right activity unfolds without effort. This is the paradox of spiritual life. The more you relinquish the attempt to make life conform to your desires, the more life begins to reflect the harmony that has always existed in the invisible. You are not creating harmony, you are revealing it. And perhaps the most beautiful effect of all is this: peace becomes natural, not the peace of improved circumstances, but the peace that flows from the awareness that God is the only activity of your being. When this peace takes root, you do not look to the world for assurance. You do not depend on achievements for security. You do not measure your spiritual progress by outer signs. You live from a different center, a center not touched by events, not shaken by appearances, not dependent on conditions. This is what happens when you stop asking God for things. You discover that everything you sought through asking was already present, waiting only for recognition. Now, my friends, having spoken of prayer as listening rather than asking, Let us enter together the essence of that practice, not as a technique, not as a method, but as a quiet recognition of what already is. In this moment, we set aside the belief that prayer is something we do. We rest in the truth that prayer is something we receive. It is the inner atmosphere in which the presence reveals itself. Let us begin by releasing the sense of personal striving. There is no need to accomplish anything, no need to achieve a result, no need to change a condition. Simply allow yourself to become aware of a gentle truth. There is a presence living your life. You are not alone. You are not separate. You are not a human being reaching up to God. God is the very essence of your being, expressing as you. Now, let us quietly acknowledge that we bring nothing to this moment, not our fears, not our desires, not our hopes, not our petitions. We come empty. We come receptive. We come without agenda. For true prayer begins where human thought ends. And so we rest without effort in this inner spaciousness. Notice not with the mind, but with the heart of awareness that there is a subtle peace already present. You did not create it. You did not initiate it. It is simply here. It has always been here. It is the peace that passeth understanding, the peace that has nothing to do with conditions. In this stillness, we are not seeking a message. We are not listening for words. We are simply becoming aware of the presence that needs no language to make itself known. It is the still small voice not heard with the ears, but felt as a gentle assurance, a quiet certainty that everything necessary is unfolding through the activity of the Father within. This is the essence of true prayer. The silent recognition of a presence so complete, so loving, so intelligent that it requires nothing from you except receptivity. If a thought arises, let it pass without attachment. There is nothing to analyze, nothing to correct, nothing to achieve. You are resting in the awareness that God is already doing the work. God is the life of your being. God is the law of harmony governing your experience. God is the substance of your supply, the health of your body, the peace of your soul. As we remain in this quietness, you may feel a sense of inner fullness, an unseen presence that seems to expand within you. This is not emotion. It is not imagination. It is the activity of spirit revealing itself where the personal mind has become still. In this awareness, no fear can remain. In this awareness, no sense of lack can persist. In this awareness, no problem has reality. Not because you have solved anything, but because you have come into alignment with the one who solves all by the simple fact of its being. Let us rest a little longer in this recognition. The Father within me is doing the work, not as a future act, not as a hoped-for intervention, but as a permanent and ongoing reality. The work of God is continuous. Prayer merely opens the inner door through which we may behold it. And now, as we prepare to move forward, let us gently acknowledge that nothing needs to be added to this moment. We have touched the essence of prayer, not as words, not as requests, but as a sacred awareness of the presence that lives us, breathes us, sustains us, and fulfills every need before we know it. This is the infinite way of prayer, a listening stillness in which God reveals God. And now, as we bring this period of sharing to its close, let us gather the essence of what is unfolded, not as a summary of ideas, but as a quiet recognition in your own heart. The great truth we have touched together is simply this. The moment you stop asking God for anything, you discover that nothing has ever been withheld from you. When the mind is occupied with requests, with desires, with fears, it cannot perceive the presence that stands at the doorway of consciousness, forever saying, I am here. Asking blinds you, not because it is wrong, but because it arises from a belief in separation. Asking assumes a God apart from you, a good not yet given, a grace that must be earned. But in the silence that follows the end of asking, a new awareness dawns. Everything you sought from God is already established within your own being. To cease asking is not to renounce prayer, it is to enter true prayer. It is to release the burden of trying to shape life through thought and to rest in the assurance that the Father within is eternally expressing its completeness as your experience. When you stop pleading, you begin recognizing. When you stop striving, you begin receiving. When you stop reaching outward, you begin awakening inward. And in that awakening, you see that health was never separate from you, that supply was never external, that harmony was never absent. They were hidden only by the noise of human desire. Grace was functioning long before you asked. Grace will continue to function long after all asking has ceased. The world may appear as it did before, yet everything is different. For now you know that God is not a power to be invoked, but a presence to be recognized. You know that prayer is not the utterance of words, but the opening of consciousness. You know that the good you seek does not come from the world, but flows from the infinite center of your being, expressed as your daily life through the quiet activity of spirit. So let this understanding rest gently within you. You do not pray to get, you pray to behold. You do not pray to change conditions. You pray to see the unreality of the conditions that fear created. You do not pray for God to act. You pray to become aware that God is the only activity there is. And as you walk out into the world, you carry this inner assurance with you, not as a belief, but as a living presence. The Father and I are one. All that the Father hath is mine. I rest in the completeness of God. My friends, this is the infinite way, not a path of effort, but of receptivity, not a journey of seeking, but of recognizing, not a practice of asking, but of listening, not an attempt to reach God, but the quiet discovery that God has been your very self all along. May this awareness go before you, illuminate your days, and reveal the harmony that has forever been your inheritance.